Thanks, David. Thanks, everyone, for making time this afternoon. Wade?
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, we're going to work through the slide deck here and spend some time talking about, within 25-30 minutes, how you can gain greater insight to your well-being and practical tools and strategies on how you may be able to better manage that.
Yeah, so what we'll start with, we're not going to be able to cover everything there is to feel like you've dialed in on all your well-being strategies in 30 minutes, but we do want you to take the next little while and mostly think about yourself, a little bit about the profession and sort of wellness issues that may occur within the profession, but really also to think about yourself. So I just want you to take a minute and read through this checklist. It's over 2 slides. And when you're doing it, just actually think in your head, yes or no. Don't just read it, but think yes or no, and try to keep a bit of a running gauge around, am I getting more yeses or more nos, is really what we want you to do. And these are obviously not anything to do with research, just getting a sense of where you're at with some of these things. So give it a read through, and then we'll click over to the next slide and think yes or no. All right, I'm going to click over. Okay, and with that, I just want you to just keep in the back of your mind for now until we get closer to the end around sort of where you think you're at with some of those things. Were you more yeses or more nos is really where we'll start with.
Okay, Wade, what about wellness? What is wellness?
Yeah, and I think what we'll do actually is say this is more, we're going to cover some of these things here. So we're going to actually, we will answer the question, what is wellness? We're going to try to go through some of the components for you, and then we're going to try to think about, okay, well, what's the difference between being ill and being well? Are they the same thing? Are they not? So with this question here on this slide, even if we aren't sick, are we well? And there is a difference between sort of disability and illness and wellness. You hear the term wellness a lot now. It has a lot of different, I guess, definitions, but I think the best way to think about wellness is starting with something else, which is disability. When you think about disability, it involves sort of where a person is at diagnostically or medically, sometimes sort of relative to illness or an impairment, and how that relates to sort of barriers they're encountering outside of themselves, whether it's at work or society, different environments. When we talk about wellness, we're actually talking about a more broad term that encompasses in what we'll use 8 components of wellness, and there's other places that you'll use 5 and 10, but we're going to focus on 8. But really what it means is really focusing on various components of a person's being. And the difference really with disability is there's really no, if you have a diagnosed illness, that really wasn't a choice, but wellness does oftentimes involve decision-making and some of the choices that people make in their lives that can lead to increased wellness or poor wellness. So poor wellness can lead to disability or illness for sure, but disability does not necessarily mean that somebody isn't well. And we'll sort of explain that maybe a little bit in a bit. But really when we think about wellness, we're trying to really think about where people are at with the different components of their life. There's physical, environmental, financial, occupational, intellectual, spiritual, emotional and mental, and social. And I think we've all heard some version of this at different times, that wellness is not just the physical, but it really is what we hear the most. And I guess these days a lot with like Bell Let's Talk and those things, a lot about mental health too. But when we're thinking about wellness, we want to make sure we're focusing on all the areas of our life if we're going to sort of think about wellness and balance. So oftentimes those 2 words are used interchangeably. Just quickly, we'll kind of cover off a little bit around what we mean by these things before we move on. I think physical wellness is probably the easiest to define. It's what we're sort of the most used to. We're talking about things like mobility, nutrition, exercise, sleep, medical, sort of physical medical diagnoses and stability, dental hygiene, sexual health. Those are things that we think about when we're thinking about physical wellness. When we're talking about environmental wellness, it's really about people's ability to interact and be involved with their natural surroundings, but also the environments that they're forced into sometimes with work. There can be some interchange between environmental and occupational, but really it's how you sort of respond to and interact within your environment. Financial is pretty straightforward. Are you living within your means? Do you feel as though you have control over your finances? Is it causing you lots of stress, or are you feeling like you're managing pretty well in the financial category? Occupational wellness really involves, are people satisfied with their jobs? Do they feel challenged? Sometimes it can even be a little bit too challenged, because there are times where we need to feel that way, but not all the time. So is your job rewarding but not completely overwhelming? Are the things that you do within your job that you enjoy? You might not like everything, but you generally feel satisfied within the scope of your occupation. And that's how we kind of define occupational wellness. When we're talking about intellectual wellness, it's really, are you engaging in new activities? Do you feel stimulated? Are you able to do things that might be outside of your occupation that you still find to be intellectually challenging and help you move forward? The sort of common example people give for that is travel or learning a language, trying something new that kind of stimulates people, because oftentimes when they do intellectually challenging things, it's oftentimes related to their occupation, and that's not always super healthy. Spiritual wellness doesn't mean religion, although it can for some people, and that's fine. It really means, do you have a sense of peace, a sense of calmness about your day-to-day life? Are you kind of happy with who you are and your place in the world? Emotional and mental wellness, pretty straightforward. Do your moods match the situation that's occurring around you? So are you generally responding appropriately? Are you feeling more often better than worse? Cognitively, are you functioning at a level that allows you to do the things you need to do? Are you sort of mentally well? And then social wellness involves interaction with other people in positive ways. Do your social interactions influence you positively, or are you engaging in dysfunctional social relationships? So those are all the different areas of sort of wellness. And when we think about the different components of that and how that all plays in together, we really want to be looking at not just the physical and the mental. It's really how they all tie in together.
Yeah, it's important, I think, as you've identified, Wade, to take a more holistic view of self. I think people are often surprised of the different components that do make up a wellness wheel, because we have a tendency to focus on just the two you've identified, the emotional, mental, and physical. But at the end of the day, all these contribute to our sense of well-being and our ability to manage day-to-day living.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, wellness concerns. Well, as a community as a whole, there's a number of obvious ones that most people are concerned about on a regular basis, including eating healthy and their weight, exercise, sleep, health, heart disease and stroke, cancer, depression, anxiety, mental health, and maintaining social connections. But for educational leaders, of course, there's more factors and more concerns that are laid on top of that. And Wade, maybe you could speak to a bit more of that.
Yeah, I think for people who work in education across the board, people in leadership positions, principals, vice principals, what we hear all the time is the idea of work-life balance. It's a term that's not entirely always understood, and sometimes people put more pressure on themselves to have this sense of balance, which isn't even really well defined. But ultimately, that is something that comes up time and time again as a wellness concern for people who work in education. The other thing that comes up time again is the idea of stress. Very few people will say, I'm depressed or I'm anxious, but we do often hear people say, I'm feeling a lot of stress, I'm feeling overwhelmed. And the idea of being, when that happens, your ability to manage conflict, goes down, plus more things seem like they're conflictual when maybe they're not. So the two do go hand in hand. Conflict is harder to manage when you're feeling overwhelmed. For the jobs that you do, the idea, you're probably laughing now if we're going to say time and task management, because of course that's not possible all the time, but it is something that affects people's wellness as a major concern for there's just too much to do and too little time, is essentially, and over a period of time, that wears people down. On the physical side of things, obviously exercise and weight loss management, that's not something, we don't focus on weight loss as a physical wellness issue very much, because it's not the right reason to engage in things that necessarily improve physical wellness. But it is, sometimes it's a marker. And so we hear that a lot, that people will say, I'm not able to engage in the things I used to, I'm not exercising and I'm gaining weight. And so it's a bit of a way that people monitor where they're at, as opposed to, other factors. But that's definitely something that comes up a lot. And people being affected by the workload, kind of goes without saying. Sleep, we work with a lot of people with a lot of different medical and wellness related barriers, and almost all of them struggle with sleep at some point or another, whether it's just racing thoughts, just too much to do, not taking enough time to sleep. But over time, again, sleep is a major wellness concern for people in education. And then the idea of having enough time for self-care and personal time. Sometimes that overlaps in the family, of course, but it's a little bit of a separate thing, like having time to do the things that you yourself may want to do. That's usually the last thing that gets taken care of, if at all. People who work in education usually put other people before themselves, and obviously yourself comes last. So as a wellness issue, that's not always the way that people would recommend to manage wellness, but it is a part of the job, and we do get that for sure.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk to this?
Yeah. So just briefly, this is an outcome of a survey done by the BCPVA over this last few years. And we'll just go through a couple of the graphs that we've identified as being kind of apropos for this conversation today. First and foremost, I feel overwhelmed by the volume and complexity of my work. There was over 400 administrators that responded to it. And if you can see by the graph, most people on occasionally feel overwhelmed by their work, some seldom. But I think what the most telling thing is that Wade and I were looking at when we were preparing for this conversation today is the number of people that find often and daily feeling overwhelmed by their work. And I think we calculated that as being approximately what, almost 30% of the participants. Yeah, which is high. And then if you look at Q32 here, I believe that I cope well with the volume and complexity of my work. In spite of that, there's a lot of people that, even with all that complexity of feeling overwhelmed at times, they do a good job of managing it. They agree or strongly agree to that. That being said, there is a proportion there again that struggle with the volume and complexity of the work.
Yeah, so I think like there's positives and negatives in both of these slides. On the pro side of wellness, that obviously people are in this profession are doing some things that they're managing their wellness, at least on the coping side, which would be on the sort of mental emotional health side of things. But there are still some other people who are either very vulnerable or already past that vulnerability and probably getting into disability of some sort. And we hear the term I mentioned earlier a lot about work-life balance. So even despite that, on this slide, when the question was asked, I have a healthy work-life balance, most respondents, the majority of people responded either disagree or strongly disagree. And there are some that do, so somewhere it's possible, and that is actually an important point. But for the most part, it's not a part of most people's daily lives is to feel like they have some sort of work-life balance. And again, if we think about balance as being very similar to wellness, again, the terms can oftentimes be interchanged. People will say, I don't feel well, it's because they don't have a sense of balance in their lives. And the other term that obviously gets thrown out is the idea of being stressed and feeling a bit overwhelmed by that. And so when we talk about stress, that's usually what people, like I mentioned before, it's usually what people will say, like, I feel stressed. So we figured for the point of our talk, we should actually probably define what that means a little bit and how sort of stress affects wellness, and particularly in your jobs.
Yeah, I think it's really important to also note that, administrators in general are really high level functioning, well people. I mean, you don't get into the organization at that level or the public education sector at that level without being successful in managing yourself on a whole multitude of levels within that wellness wheel. So as a starting point, administrators are well, and they're well managed and take care of themselves. As the descriptor shows here, stress is the reaction that occurs when we experience a change in positive or negative, or something we perceive as a threat. So it's a physiological response at the end of the day.
And a mental response.
Yeah, a mental response as well. There's a list of stresses associated with a job that can be long and involves all levels, given that your role is often a leadership within a school site, sometimes within the district office proper. But there's as we identified earlier on, there's a whole host of additional stressors that you're managing on a day-to-day basis. Some of that, for most people, it's really alluring and creates a sense of vitality and well-being. But we also know there's times when we're not feeling as confident or as strong. It can be overwhelming and feeling at times just too much.
Yeah, and I think it's being accountable and having to deal with a wide range of stakeholders as well, right? Which increases, like we could have listed, right now you're probably thinking like, oh, the list of stressors, it was too long to put on slides. The scope of the job in administration is huge and dealing with so many different players. And that's really, in my opinion, plays a huge role in why the job can be so challenging at times, is that there's such a huge level of accountability across so many levels. So students to government, it goes across so many different areas, and over time, like, stress isn't necessarily negative. It's generally pretty neutral, to be honest. But the term gets used interchangeably with anxiety, which isn't exactly true, but it does have, we do tend to think of it as being a negative, something negative. If somebody says I'm stressed, they're generally not telling you they feel good. But so for the most part, when we talk about stress, we are more focusing on the areas that can affect you in a more negative way. And when that happens, as you all know, this is telling you something but it can affect your mood when you're having stress over time. It can affect your levels of anxiety. It can affect concentration and your ability to feel like you're present. As part of that can be due to poor sleep or just being distracted and feeling overwhelmed. It can affect your ability to engage in positive executive functioning, things like problem solving, decision making, conflict resolution, which is a huge part of the job of an administrator. And if you're overwhelmed and having huge amounts of stress, that decreases, which obviously can create problems. And then obviously, like I mentioned, sleep already too. So there's a longer list, but those are the main things that we hear in terms of stress affecting people in their jobs.
Okay, what are the impacts of long-term stress in the profession? Well, you may have seen others in your profession experience mental illness or burnout. Presenteeism occurs. Working in isolation, people become more isolated. There's more conflict. There's a greater amount of turnover. There's negative perceptions of the role, and people end up leaving early. Again, it's tricky with administrators because they're just so invested and committed and intrinsically driven by the work they do, and part of a collective that is just gives so much discretionary effort all the time to the profession and the people they're working with. So those individuals are, as you are, very resilient, very strong. But over time, even the strong and the most resilient can experience some significant impacts from the stress. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah, and I think one of the important points here is the working in isolation, because there already is a certain isolation built into the job, sometimes geographically, but also sometimes just can be in the culture of a school or just the area where people work. So as people tend to move towards being unwell, they oftentimes will isolate themselves even more. So in a profession that already has a little bit of that, it definitely can lead to people not getting supports at a time when they need it. And then oftentimes when they do ask for it, it's maybe, I don't want to use the term too late, but it could have been done a bit earlier to save the level of being unwell that people will attain. So, there's burnout, of course. We know there's mental illness, but at the same time, it's that being isolated is a major part of this profession in terms of how the long-term effects of stress.
Yeah, and overall administrators actually manage very well. They manage stress and their sense of well-being very well. That being said, we know the complexity of the job, the greater engagement of stakeholders, some of the changes in the language of the MOU and the effect on school-based requirements has put more stress on administrators provincially. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, and even with this, how are our administrators doing? Generally pretty good. I think that there's a certain quality of people that you need to have a certain level of being able to cope, being able to problem solve, manage conflict, manage people to be in that job. At the same time, the principals and vice principals that we're seeing through our support programs, the IP, and just even the work we're doing on our own, is mostly mental health. We very rarely see people who are coming to ask for support for physical health reasons. And that might just be that people aren't asking for it, and maybe should be. But overall, we're seeing people asking for help due to mental health reasons, and that starts with feeling stressed. The job itself is a little bit of this. What this graph shows a little bit is, in my mind, a little bit around why that might be. And without being able to actually point at, because I don't think I have the ability. Oh, I do. Well, does the cursor show? If I use the cursor, okay. So I can't point, but I'll do my best to explain this. Ideally, or what this is for people in their jobs. People do better when there's a little bit of stress. People function well when they're stressed. And if you think about one of the common analogies is actually athletes. So athletes, typically a great athlete performs when there's a certain amount of stress on them. In a big game, they don't always do great in practice. There's just not enough stress there. So that applies to everybody. This is part of a curve that's been around since essentially the 1800s that shows that people perform best when there's a little bit of stress. In education and the job of administrators, the problem with that is that the job itself for any administrator who's just doing their job, they're not unwell, the job itself is right there at that peak. Like that is where the job is. It's sort of already in a perfect situation between challenge and strain. And so on a day-to-day basis, most people are managing pretty well. And they're just managing right at that top of the level. But what happens is when there is an increase in stressors, or if somebody has something happen in their personal life, if something's going on at school, because you're already at the top, there's nowhere to go but down. And so what we find is that oftentimes over the course of a school year, people might start more towards the challenge side, but towards the end of the school year, they're already there in that kind of strain area. And if there's anything added in, people start to slide towards dysfunction. Many people function in a state of dysfunction. They'll do well in their jobs, but maybe they're not managing their personal lives or managing their own personal wellness in other areas. But again, over time, that starts to wear people down. And in a profession with such high demands, when you're already working at the top, there's nowhere to go but down. That's usually where people end up going. And that's obviously who we end up seeing when we're trying to work on some of these mental health issues. And so that's kind of like the continuum of stress. And really, I guess, as you're thinking about yourself, you can even use this as one of those tools to think about, like, where would you put yourself right now? Where would you have put yourself at the end of last school year if you were to put yourself on this continuum of stress?
Okay, well, here's the wellness map. And as you recall from the initial slide, there are 8 separate quadrants. And we thought it might be fun if you just take a couple quick seconds and take a look at the map, and you can see you can chart from 1 to 10 in each area. So for example, 1 being very low, 10 being very high. If you could just take a quick second and kind of sketch out on a piece of paper, if you have one hand, or even in your mind, what that might look like for you in terms of areas that are more concerning, or actually areas that are you're managing extremely well.
Yeah, exactly. So you can see on the left, that's just the sort of blank version, and you'll end up with something that kind of looks like your own personal version of what's on the right. And think back to how you answered those initial questions on our first slides. Think a little bit about where you are on the graph, and then obviously where you put yourself on these wellness wheel components. We'll just give you a few seconds to do that. It doesn't have to be exact. So as you do that, you'll see something, like whether it's in your mind or on paper, around having a diagram that represents that is representative, something like the one on the right, that has the lines, the dots actually joined up by lines. So really the first question is, like, what does should kind of look like something like a circle if somebody had a lot of balance and was feeling really well. What does your circle actually look like? So that's the first thing. What does it look like? Is it a circle? Is it a square? Is it all over the map? What does it actually look like? That's sort of the first question. The second question is, if you do have a circle, or you do have something that resembles a circle, is it sort of closer to the middle or closer to the outer edge? And that's, I've had some people who've had some circles really close to the middle. It's a circle which represents balance, but it actually represents a consistent imbalance. If you can see, imagine if you had threes in all these categories, like that's maybe a nice circle, but it's not a super high level of wellness in multiple categories. And so that's not really representative of having a great deal of balance. It's actually more representative of having a great deal of imbalance. And most people don't do that. Most people will have some pretty high levels of wellness, and then maybe one or two areas that are really sticking out.
Especially administrators.
That's right. Like it would be a rare person who was able to sort of function on a day-to-day basis who are ones across the board. Okay. What you want to be thinking about as you're looking at this then is what areas are clearly distorting you from having a little bit of a circle. And are those areas that for you, do you think would be worth focusing on if you were going to choose to focus on your wellness? So one of the things a lot of people will say is, you know what, I need to start going to the gym. I need to start eating better. But if you've already given yourself an 8 on physical wellness, but you gave yourself a 2, or yeah, right here, like if you give yourself a 3 on social or 4 on social, like maybe that's a better place to start if you wanted to look at improving wellness and having a little bit more balance. Again, this isn't necessarily exact. Of course, you can go to the gym, but if to improve wellness, you want to focus on areas that are maybe already a little bit of a challenge for you. And the other question is, think about maybe you're doing a little better than you thought. And this does come up a lot of times with us, is people will do this exercise and they will then see, like, because it's actually like depicted in front of them, you know what, I'm maybe doing better than I thought I was doing overall. Sure, there's some areas I could improve, but we do tend to beat ourselves up about things we're not doing. I'm not eating well, I'm not going to the gym, I'm not engaging in all these things I want to do. But when you really do think about it, given the scope of your life, you might be doing a little better than you think. So that's why we use this as a bit of a starting point, but really for you to think about where you're at. Okay, we're going to wrap up here a little bit. Oops. And what we thought we'd do, again, it's 30 minutes to talk about a lot of things, but we did want to leave you with, I guess, the idea that if you've thought about your wellness for the last 30 minutes and you think, okay, I actually do want to maybe do something about this, there's some areas I could improve on, these are some things to maybe focus on. Yeah, so reach out, contact your physician, make contact with your EAP counselor. The reps here, the BCPA, are really knowledgeable and readily available. Engage in the EIP program if your districts are participating in that at this stage. Physiotherapists, occupational therapists, massage therapists. At the end of the day, reach out to people if you're identifying areas where you feel they could help you establish some goals and address some of those wellness concerns that you've seen. I'll just jump in quick. Yeah. Ask for help. If it's something that's really important to you, if you could have done it on your own, you probably would have by now. So it's always easier to get some help from somebody who knows how to help you move forward. Yeah. Yeah, and if you are setting goals, commit to them. Make them reasonable. We all know the SMART acronym. Take some time to establish those goals that are reasonable and timely. When you're considering your own thinking, try to be realistic about your expectations of yourself and others. I mean, it's often for administrators that they have such a high expectation of themselves and how they come every day or show up every day at work, and that can be overwhelming in itself. So adjust your thinking to be more reasonable around a more longitudinal version of balance, as opposed to week by week or day by day. Set boundaries, as the note says here. Is it better to work late twice per week than 4 times? And can you ask for help? Are you able to say no? It's tough. Your job is demanding. There is a lot of volume. It's probably unquenchable at the end of the day to get everything done. But there are places you can say no, and really at the end of the day, that's the wiggle room we're looking for. Do the easy things: exercise, eat well, sleep, breathe. Yeah, easy is in quotation marks there, because they're not easy, but they are maybe easier than making huge changes to how you work, or changing the way you think, or addressing mental health. Like, those are things that generally are a little easier to structure.
Yeah, and last, reach out to your colleagues and your PvP group and your mid team. You know, there's a kind of a bravado at times that we see around people not willing to disclose they're challenged, and your immediate team will probably feel the same stressors, or more important, they'd be concerned for and be wanting to chip in. So reach out to your own team and your local PV group and colleagues as you see fit.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, fellas. We've got a couple questions here. Hope you have a little bit of time to address them. You mentioned something about self-awareness. We've got a question about, are there tools out there that track stress levels, something to be proactive about? And if there are, or are there, you know, self-checks that we can do that, what are the significant red flags that we might look for?
It's a good question. I don't know if I have an exact answer for you. If you go online, there's lots of ways to kind of sort of either journal or just check in your level of stress. I'm not entirely sure. Like if you set, I don't know if you need something super structured. Like you could probably just make that like a daily check-in, like a self check-in. People will do that, and trying to figure out like where are they at with their daily stress. I think the tool itself is maybe not the most important thing, because you can kind of do that just on your own. But what you do with that information is probably the important thing, right? So if you find that you're rating your stress and you get into a pattern, okay, every day at the end of school, I'm going to rate my stress levels, and you're finding they're consistently 7, 8, 7, 9, 6, 9. What are you going to do with that then? There's obviously you can do check-ins with like a counselor or psychologist, but it's more, okay, I am realizing now that my stress levels are a bit higher. What am I going to do with that? So we don't use a daily check-in, like official daily check-in for stress levels. They do exist online, you can do that, but it's really just more coaching you to do a daily check-in on your own. Hope I answered your question.
Okay, and this is a question I have. Can you expand on the definition of presenteeism?
Good question. Presenteeism is actually being at work but not really being there. So you show up at work, you're physically there, but mentally, emotionally, you're disconnected. You're almost numb or almost divorced from the relationship of your day-to-day work.
Yeah, 100%. I don't really need to add too much to that. But and where obviously it's similar to the term absenteeism. So people who are really struggling don't go to work, but some people and administrators are one of them. The idea of not going to work generally is not an option. So people will go to work even though they're maybe not well enough to be there. But you can't really function and do your job in that case. So they use the term presenteeism, say you're there, but you're really not doing your thing. And that creates a lot of other problems, because you'll still try to do as much as you can, but it gets spread out over a longer period of time.
And it's not super common with a lot of administrators, because just the demands of the job are so high. You just can't kind of glide through a day or kind of be there, kind of not. But at the end of the day, one of the greatest mechanisms to kind of help better manage that or communicate around that is developing a stronger bond amongst your min team, and feeling safe to explain to your colleagues that I'm having a tough day. I'm just not really here. I am here, but heads up, I may be leaning on you a bit more today, or maybe need a little support on a couple of things I typically wouldn't.
I just to say one more thing. I agree with Jack, but so far I've heard from administrators that they actually feel like before they're really reach out for help and maybe even need to go off, if that was somebody was at that point, they'll say, I've been going to work, but I haven't been doing my job as well as I want to. And that there is an element of presenteeism to that. People, administrators just they go to work. That's the thing. So
yeah, they grind.
Something to be aware of. Yeah.
Well, maybe that's a good segue. I know that you've been working on a book regarding teacher wellness. Are there, and it's coming out, so maybe it's an opportunity to speak to that. But it might be a good segue into, are there some things in the book that might be relevant to my administrative colleagues?
Most definitely. Wade, why don't you speak to this, because it's your name on the title?
We do a lot of work with teachers as well, and I've been doing that for a long time. So yes, there's a lot of that information that goes across. Essentially it covers off the areas of the wellness wheel, and it starts with the same thing we kind of did with you very, very quickly, is try to take some time to think about yourself and where you're at, and then some strategies to improve wellness in each of the areas is pretty much how it goes. Of course, there's lots of overlap. It's not teacher specific in so much that only teachers can use it. The information is generalized across the board. There's some things that are very specific. At some point, we would hope to be able to do something for administration as well. But ultimately, the strategies for wellness go across all jobs, the generalities around making good decisions, making sure that your thinking and your perceptions are solid, that you're doing things that can lead to being well, and trying to have some semblance of balance. And that doesn't mean balance in a day. It means balance over a longer period of time.
Yeah, and just to add to that, the Well Teacher is off to printer as of today, I believe, and we'll have that up and running in 2 weeks' time. You can check our website at humanworks.ca for the book. There will be copies available. I'd just like to add this before we wrap up from my end. But anyways, I think what's most important is that one develops a certain level of awareness and engagement in their day-to-day living and their wellness around that, not in a way where it's overwhelming and they're feeling that it's as a result of that more stressful, but in a way that develops a more ongoing relationship that's honest and transparent about where I'm at, what I need, and when I do need something to actually reach out and access it.
Perfect, thank you. So just on behalf of the association, I'd like to thank Jack and Wade for being here today. And just a reminder that we are recording today's webinar, and please feel free to share it once we post the actual link to it. That'll be happening. And again, thank you for taking the time in a short period of time, 30, 35 minutes. You've given us a good outline from the research, some strategic things to think about, and some practical follow-up ideas. And to do that in 35 minutes is admirable. So thank you so much, and take care.
Great to be here. Thank you.